Thanks a lot for having me. I will now present the interview archive Forced Labor 1939 to 1945. And in my presentation, I would like to present this archive as an attempt to turn life stories and oral histories into public history. And I will try to show how we try to use testimonies with former forced laborers as a way to commemorate the victims, but also as a source for research and a tool for teaching about the past and about forced labor. We heard a lot about facts and figures. I keep this part short. So between 1939 and 1945, Nazi Germany created one of the largest forced labor systems in history. Over 20 million foreign civilian workers, concentration camp prisoners, and prisoners of war from all the occupied countries were required to perform forced labor in Germany in the course of the Second World War. At the height of the so-called Ausländereinsatz, so the use of foreigners, in August 1944, 6 million civilians were forced to perform forced labor in the German Reich, most of them from Poland and the Soviet Union. In 1944, nearly 2 million prisoners of war were exploited to work in the German economy. From 1943, German industry also increasingly used concentration camp detainees as a source of forced labor. So to make this short, in Nazi Germany of 1944, 1 in every 5 jobs was done by a forced laborer. 1 job in every 4 in the armament industry was done by a forced laborer. Almost half of the people employed in agriculture in 1943 to 1944 were foreign workers or prisoners of war. Only because of the forced laborers could the German population be sustained with supplies and the arms production maintained. Major corporations, as well as small craft industry, communes and administrative office, but even farmers and private households continued to demand more and more foreign laborers, and in this way they were jointly responsible for and profited from the system of forced labor. Especially the industry profited on a large scale from the expansion of production made possible by forced laborers. For a long, long time in Germany, the forced laborers had counted among the forgotten victims of National Socialism and also among the groups of victims who were not taken into consideration by German compensation law. Forced labor was not recognized as a specific Nazi crime. Only in the year 2000, and after this difficult international negotiations, the Foundation Remembrance, Responsibility and Future, EVZ, that also funds this event today, was founded by a federal law, and German companies contributed with nearly 5 billion Deutschmark to the 10 billion Deutschmark in funds for the compensation of forced laborers, as well as for the establishment of a separate Remembrance and Future Fund. I just said this as a background, to give a little background for our archive, because the online archive Forced Labor 1939 to 1945 was created to preserve the memory of the over 20 million former forced laborers and to make their voices heard. The interviews were collected from 2005 to 2006 within the scope of the project Documentation of Life Story Interviews with Former Slave and Forced Laborers. The collection contains 590 life story interviews with former prisoners of concentration camps, civilian forced laborers, as well as prisoners of war. The Institute for History and Biography at the Fernuniversität Hagen, it was a project of Alexander von Plato, Almut Lee, and Christoph Thonfeld. They coordinated the project and decided upon the interviewing methodology and developed the interview guidelines. Oops. The interviews were conducted by 32 project teams in 26 countries, primarily in Central and Eastern Europe. Most of the interviews were recorded in the Ukraine, Poland, and Russia. About a third of the interviewees were so-called slave laborers in concentration camps. 134 witnesses are Jewish survivors and 46 Sinti or Roma. The collection also includes testimonies of survivors of forgotten victim groups, such as those subjected to forced Germanization or Italian military internees. The 190 video and 393 audio interviews were conducted in the native language of the witnesses or in their present adopted language. The detailed biographical interviews average 3 to 4 hours in length. Most of them took place in the homes of the interviewees. The proposed interview method can be described as semi-open narrative interview. This implies a 3 to 4 stage interview. First, the interviewees should be given the opportunity to present their life stories as they wish. In a second phase, the interviewers could ask for explanations about the story narrated, and in a third stage, they would ask thematic questions, especially about forced labor. Of course, the various interviewers and project teams have applied the interview guidelines differently. In a way, the interviews of each project team can be seen as a separate sub-collection. The interview project in Serbia was conducted by Barbara Wiesinger from the University of Salzburg in Austria. The 10 witnesses were interviewed in 2005. Some names were, the interviewees were found by information from the International Organization of Migration that also did the compensation, was involved in the compensation process, and some were found via other interviewees. The 5 women and 5 men were born between 1920 and 1933. They are, by their own definition, ethnic Serbs. When the persecution began, 6 of the interviewees lived in so-called independent state of Croatia, 3 in the Hungarian occupied territory and 1 in the military occupation zone of Serbia. 3 of the interviewees have a rural background. The others worked in industry or trades or were dependent on the wage work of family members. 3 were persecuted because of their religious affiliation and ethnic identity. 1 was taken prisoner as a partisan. 4 others were arrested because of resistance activities, and 1 was arrested during a roundup and came to Germany as a prisoner. And 1 came to Germany as a prisoner of war. This example is it describes pretty well the way this archive is put together. So there was this one group who was responsible for Serbia and who decided upon who was interviewed, decided upon the sample, and also about how the interviews were conducted then. So in 2007, the Free University Berlin, in cooperation with the German Historical Museum, was appointed to implement the project Forced Labor 1939 to 1945. This means there was a second project after the interviews were conducted that aimed at permanently securing, allocating, and in-depth indexing the interviews of the collection and their accompanying materials. So the project includes the archiving, the digitizing, and the building of an online platform, the translating, the segmenting, and indexing of the interviews, as well as the preparation of educational material. Here you can see our website. What is very important about the project is that it does not only address researchers, but also the general public. So we have a website that gives the background information about forced labor. Everything I said now you can read it in detail on this website. And it is like a framework, and within this framework you can access the online archive. So the result of the endeavor is the fully indexed multilingual online archive Forced Labor. as well as the educational material. The online archive, as you can access it today, is the result of the work of many different people and institutions that, of course, shaped the collection and the archive and the way it is presented today. So I already mentioned the team of the Institute of History and Biography at the Fernuniversität Hagen that has decided upon the academic interviewing methodology, the 32 international project teams that have chosen the interviewees and applied the interview guidelines according to their academic or political agenda, our team at Freie Universität Berlin that decided upon how the interviews were indexed and presented online, and last but not least, also the Foundation Remembrance, Responsibility and Future that played and still plays a major role for the project. Although the foundation is financing the creation, archiving, development, and indexing of the interview collection, her role differs from one of a classical academic funding institution. Both the interview project at Fernuniversität Hagen and the online archive project at FU Berlin were and are fully financed by the foundation, although every financed project step has to be applied for. The applications are not part of an open application line, so the foundation initiated the project idea and owns the copyright for the interviews. This is specific. I say this because I'm also a little bit critical about this, because the EVZ is also the institution that was responsible for paying the compensation of the victims, and now this archive can also serve a little bit as a proof of a successful compensation of forced laborers, what of course did not take place, or just to a small extent. But I'm not too critical because I like the project a lot. So from the beginning on, the project wasn't planned as a German one, but had a very international focus. The archive, with interviews conducted in 25 languages, is completely available in German. The user interface and data about the people and the interviews are also available in English and in Russian. The table of contents, captions, short biographies, and editorial comments are available in Russian for the Russian interviews and in English for the English interviews. And interviews in other languages are displayed in German. There you can see we have three versions that are accessible. Furthermore, the learning application, the accompanying learning application exists in German, in Czech, in Russian, and is about to be created in Polish. So the archive wants to reach as many people as possible, but is only accessible after a registration. This means everybody can access the archive if he or she has access to the internet, but a prior registration is required. We did this that way because we want to try to avoid misuse, and we want to know who is accessing the interviews. Do I have 5 more minutes? 2 more? Yeah? Okay. We have created various ways to access the interviews. As all testimonies have been transcribed, we were able to create a full text search that allows for an intuitive access via search terms that suit specific research motivations. For example, here I typed in Bohr and I found those results. I think only the one with Milan Pantovic is really speaking about the Bohr mine, but yeah, at least you can find the word. Yeah. Furthermore, content categories such as language, persecution group, and deployment area provide the opportunity of a thematically structured access and can serve as extra filters. yeah, you can see here I looked for language Serbian, and I could, and then I see all the 10 interviews that have been conducted in Serbian, but I can now, I can just now choose just people who worked in mining, for example, and it will reduce the results. The second, this is what I showed before, is a pretty classical approach to an archive. What was important to us was also to show the provenance of the interviews. So the fact that they were conducted by various project partners is important to the project. And so these different collections, I spoke about this before, are represented with their own axis. So an overview map, you can see it here, with an overview map of the project's collection illustrates the provenance of the archive and provides a regional access. So I can access the 10 testimonies you have seen before also via clicking on this map, and then all the testimonies that were conducted in Serbia show up. And the third approach is a mapping approach. So we have created an interactive map that shows sites of biographical relevance to the interviewees. For example, place of birth, places of deportation, camps, companies and prisons, and places of residence after 45, but also places that were mentioned in the interviews. This allows for a topographical research. So that is very important for our educational work as well, because as in Germany, as I have pointed out before, in every city you will find, in every street you will find a place where forced labor took place. So you can look on your city and see where interviewees talk about forced labor in your city. And yeah, this is then how you can yeah, it's a Google map, so you can also see the places how they look like now, and also then directly go to the interview, in this case this lady, and see what she said about this place. I come to the last point. This is how the interviews are displayed in the archive. And as you can see, we have on the left side information about the interview and information about the forced labor the interviewed person had to perform. And then we have a short biography of everybody. We also have transcripts and translation to download as a PDF. We have photos, and the transcript of the spoken word is displayed under the video, and you can also switch to the German translation, what's very helpful for persons like me who do not understand Serbian. So I could understand this interview by just reading the translation. And then, of course, we tried to we tried to give every interview a structure and to display the narrative structure with clickable chapters. This is what you find on the right-hand side. This is very important because of the structure of the interviews, because it follows not a chronological order, because the survivors were, or the interviewees should first give their story the way they want to tell it. So they talked about forced labor, for example, in the first part of the interview, and then later, an hour later maybe, or 2 hours later, the interviewer asked again about it. So it is not chronological, and that's why those structure and index is very helpful. Yeah. As I said before, I wanted to show this learning application live, and I didn't know that I don't have internet. So this is our learning application. teachers and students can register in this learning application, and it has the testimonies of, in this case, 6 chosen interviewees of different backgrounds with tasks for students, so they can, and with extra information for the teachers. So the it is usable in school teaching. And this is important because in Germany, forced labor is not a topic in general history teaching. So we tried to create something that that is easy to implement in teaching, because you can just use it. The interviews are shortened to a half an hour. So a teacher needs only 1.5 hours to work with this application, and the students can get an insight. So I hope that I could give a little bit of an insight to all of you, and please feel free to ask me if you have more questions. Thanks a lot.